1 second.
Did you get the file?
Good evening. Welcome to People's University Bugs and People. We're having, as you may have guessed, some technical issues, but we're working on the problem. So just stand by for a second here. I think we have it worked out. Let me see. There it is. All right. Yeah, I'm downloading your PowerPoint, so I'm going to run that here in just a second. Aaron, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Okay. And if any of you are wondering why I'm on here tonight introducing our guest, Sean asked me to because Dr. Strand was a professor of mine when I was at the University of Wisconsin. And I was very happy that he agreed to do a program for us because he was absolutely one of my favorite professors at my time at UW-Madison. He's a great educator, and I think you'll find that out tonight. Michael R. Strand, PhD, is H.M. Pulliam Chair, Department of Entomology at the University of Georgia, where he's been a professor since 2001. Prior to moving to Georgia, he was a professor of entomology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 14 years. In 2013, he was named Regents Professor, and in 2017, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Strand's research laboratory features a team of researchers with various backgrounds who investigate many areas under the broad umbrella of insect physiology. Results of the team's finding are published in peer-reviewed scientific journals and shared via presentations at scientific meetings and seminars around the world. And today he'll be presenting here in Wheeling, West Virginia. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Strand.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so sorry about the technical hiccups.
No worries.
I'm going to now start your PowerPoint and remove myself from the screen.
So will I be able to move it, advance it, or will you have to?
I'll have to do it. Just tell me when you need the next slide.
Okay. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so Aaron just finished saying that that we mostly work on the physiology and biochemistry and molecular biology of insects. Go ahead, next one, Sean. And if I had control of the slides, that this might be a little more seamless. But what I wanted to try to say to everybody is that I think all of the people who've spoken in this program, they're all pretty amazed by the abundance and diversity of insects. And next, Sean, go ahead and just call them all up. There you go. So entomology, the study of insects, it pretty much exists where people get paid to work on insects because so many insects are really important pests. But the people who've spoken with you today, including myself, I think all of us want to convey that insects have a lot of really positive effects in our world. And the various groups that we've been talking about, I think everyone has tried really hard to share the positives and not necessarily fully dwell on the negatives. And in this regard, I kind of face a pretty big challenge because Sean asked me to talk about flies, which have to be among the most disliked insects to just about everybody. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a group that's not very much loved by people, but try to share with you that there are definitely some flies that are not very lovable, but there are a number that actually really are. Next slide. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. To start with is I'm just going to call it fly factoids, just a little bit about the general biology of the group. And then in the spirit of positivity, I was going to talk first a little bit about flies that are really beneficial to our planet or directly beneficial to people. And then I was going to transition to those flies that I think most people are most familiar with and most depressed about, which are flies that are pests. Next slide. So, like a lot of the people who've talked in this series, where we all kind of find ourselves starting as sort of with the group that we're talking about, is to talk a little bit about where they kind of sit in the insect universe. And some people have done some really nice jobs talking about more general relationships in insect evolution. So you've had people that have talked to you about grasshoppers and katydids and cicadas and beetles, wasps and bees and ants last week. And flies is where we are today. And I think the talks that'll follow will be on moths and butterflies. And other people have told the audience that insects are kind of broken up into two really big groups. Those insects that are more primitive, they show up in the fossil record earlier, and those insects that have shown up later. And the earlier ones, the juvenile stages kind of look like adults. So baby grasshoppers look a lot like adult grasshoppers. But for the more advanced insects, they go through a complete metamorphosis. And that's where you have caterpillars turning into a chrysalis and a beautiful butterfly emerging. These are holometabolous insects, and flies and beetles and moths and butterflies and wasps, bees, and ants all go through a complete metamorphosis. So the flies belong to an order that's called Diptera. Next slide. And the Diptera, what you've seen with a lot of the insect orders is it all ends with P-T-E-R-A, because a kind of common denominator for most insects is that they have wings in the adult stage. And flies are really weird relative to most insects because they look like they have only 2 wings or a pair of wings instead of having 4 wings the way most insects do. And so the namesake for the order is Diptera or Diptera for 2 wings. 125,000 species roughly worldwide, and that's a gross underestimate. It's probably 500,000 or more. And if you think about it, everybody kind of has an intuitive sense about what flies look like. And the flies that we really think of when we think of flies are things like house flies or mosquitoes. And if you think, though, about kind of the things that you're looking at on an adult fly, as first is if it looks like if you look really closely at most flies, it doesn't look like they have any antennae on their head, but they look like they have huge eyes. And so this is a general truism for most insects in this order. Flies, if you were able to look really closely at their mouths are pretty much built to lap up liquid. And they can do that in a sponge kind of way, and that's pretty benign, or they can do it in an impaling you kind of way, like with mosquitoes who are blood feeders. But they're both feeding on liquid diets, whether they're house flies, for example, or whether they're mosquitoes. But the real dead giveaway on recognizing flies is the fact that you just see 1 pair of wings. And if you look in this bottom right corner, you have an insect that's a crane fly. And if you look behind the wings, you can see these 2 tiny little, what are called halteres. In effect, what's happened in the Diptera is their second pairs of wings have gotten really reduced. They're there, but they're so small that in most species you can't see them hardly at all. Next slide. So if we take this a little bit further, the other kind of funny thing about flies is that seemingly their bodies kind of fall into 2 big categories. And this is because flies themselves sort of are subdivided into 2 big categories. So one of the categories are what are called Pneumatocera. And those are these very thin, wispy, small, usually insects. And the one that should immediately come to mind for you is something like a mosquito, which is in the order Diptera. And then the other group are what are called Brachycera. And these are real big, chunky insects. Again, they just have 1 pair of wings, but they're the kind of typical housefly looking character. And so these all belong to the same order, but their overall body shape is a bit different. And at the bottom of this slide, I've said that these brachycerans are monophyletic, and some of the other people who've spoken in this class in earlier sessions, this refers to entomologists being very confident that all of these brachycerans that exist today in the world, they all evolved from a common ancestor. By contrast, Nematoceran phylogeny is a bit messed up right now, and they actually have multiple ancestors, and so it's what we call a polyphyletic group, because it's not fully resolved in a systematic sort of way as to who the common ancestor of nematocerans are, and in actuality there's more than one. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about these groups, because everything I'm going to say downstream of this pretty much comes down to talking about different nematocerans and different brachycerans. So the one kind of generality about nematocerans is that in their immature stages, remember, these are holometabolous insects, so the immatures are sort of grub-like or caterpillar or maggot-looking creatures. Most of the nematocerans are aquatic during their immature stages, and they live in streams and ponds and other sort of aquatic environments, and most of them feed on, they're filter feeders or they're predators. They feed on detritus, things like that. And as adults, not all of them, but a great many of them blood feed on vertebrates. So things like mosquitoes again, or black flies that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But then you have insects that look a lot like mosquitoes, like midges, and as adults, they're not blood feeders at all. Next slide. So here's a kind of my most extreme nematoceran. Diptera are really about the only animals that actually live everywhere in Antarctica, and it's all due to one species, which is a nematoceran that can live in an incredibly cold climate. And it's a pretty tough slog living in Antarctica, as you might imagine. And these insects have evolved some pretty crazy adaptations to be able to live in that kind of world. The main thing is that they have all kinds of adaptations that kind of protect them from not fully freezing. So in a sense, in their blood, they have a lot of antifreeze that allows them to survive some incredibly cold temperatures. And they feed on algae and a few other things that exist in coastal Antarctica. And they've evolved in a way that they don't even have any wings at all anymore. So that's our kind of most extreme nematoceran in terms of living in a part of the planet that virtually no other animals live in, except right on the edge, like penguins and a few other vertebrates. Next slide. So let's talk very briefly about Brachycera, and we have a housefly in this image, which everybody recognizes. And the contrast I want to bring up here is that most Brachycerans are terrestrial. All the life stages are not, they're on terra firma. They don't live in an aquatic environment. And so they tend to lay, most of them, really tiny little cylindrical eggs, and their immature larval stage is a really kind of, a lot of times, fairly ugly looking thing, which is why they're called maggots. They don't seem to have any legs, and they don't have any body parts. They really just have a mouth and an anus, and they wiggle a lot, usually pale colored. And the pupal stage, they look like little bullets. And from this pupal stage will emerge this really stout-bodied adult fly, like a housefly. And the generation times for some of these insects is pretty incredible, where they can go through all of these stages in just a few days. Next slide. They also have evolved some pretty crazy extremes in the insect world. And one of the most extremes of all for Brachycerans is there are quite a few species, not houseflies, but other kinds of flies that don't lay eggs at all. They give birth to live young. So this is something the way we think about mammals. And but some insects can do this as well. And an example of it are tsetse flies, which are a disease vector that we'll say something about in just a little bit. But these individuals, rather than laying really large numbers of eggs, is they just brood a single baby much like humans do, and they give birth not so dissimilarly to humans, and they nurture the young in utero very much like mammals. And so this kind of adaptation isn't because we share an ancestor with tsetse flies, but through convergence, they've evolved a pattern of brooding that's very much like a mammal. And giving birth, I suspect, is equally painful for tsetse flies as it is for a lot of human females. Next slide. So what I want to transition to is before we start rolling around in the depressing side of flies, is to talk about flies that are really, really valuable to our planet. Next slide. The first one is that other people have talked about how important moths and butterflies are, and beetles and Hymenoptera for pollination, but the flies hardly take a back seat to any of those insects, and we have a lot of plants that are just incredibly dependent upon flies as their main pollinator. Some of the flies that you've seen that are pollinators, you maybe didn't even fully recognize as being a fly, because one of the biggest groups, which are called syrphid flies, or in the family Syrphidae, is that they're bee mimics. So they've evolved to look very much like bees. And the reason that you can spot them in a dead minute, though, is when you watch a bee on a flower, it has two pairs of wings, but the bee mimics that are syrphids, they just have one pair of wings. And so they're really remarkably similar. But on close inspection, they're actually not. But to a vertebrate or to a human, they look almost the same, which is part of the reason for the mimicry. And in the lower left of this particular slide is the syrphid, and bees are in the other three panels. So let's go to the next slide. Another group of flies that are incredibly important to us, even though we don't sometimes appreciate it, is a huge number of them are predators and parasites of other insects, in many cases other insects that are pretty obnoxious, that we think of as being pests. Our good friends, those syrphids that we had in the previous slide that are bee mimics, in their immature stages, which are in the lower panel on the left, is that they're predators. They're mostly predators of little tiny insects like aphids that are often pretty serious plant pests. Another group, bombyliids, called bee flies, another group of bee mimics, are predators and parasites. A group of flies that many of you have probably seen, even if you weren't sure what it was you were looking at, are robber flies, because some of them are just enormous, 2 or 3 inches long, and they'll light on a plant. And they always fold their wings over the top of their abdomen, which is a little unusual for flies, but these are just spectacular predators that eat huge volumes of primarily other insects. And then lastly, on the right side, we have a family of flies that are called tachinids, that actually the flies look a lot like houseflies superficially, but they're really special because they lay their eggs in and on the bodies of other insects. And those eggs hatch and their progeny feed on that host. And so if you kind of picture the movie Alien, the biology of tachinid flies is pretty much like the biology of the alien in all of those old movies that they kept making endless renditions of. And really the inspiration for the characters in those movies were insects like tachinids. Next slide. It isn't a real romantic occupation, but I think every one of us that live in a community on some level have a deep appreciation for people who work in sanitation, because when sanitation workers go on strike, everybody notices really quickly how important they are in terms of removing refuse away from where you live. Well, our whole planet would be in a bit of a fit if we didn't have all kinds of organisms that served as decomposers. And among the most important of our decomposers are many species of flies. Everybody needs to poop, but too much poop isn't all that pleasant if it doesn't magically go away. And a lot of it's going away because of flies laying large amounts of eggs on dung pats, and fly maggots for those decomposer species consuming the feces of organisms like ourselves or family pets or cows. But decomposition is way more than poop. Pretty much all of the organic matter on our planet has to cycle those nutrients back into the ecosystem. And microbes are extremely important for this, but a lot of the early decomposition is at the hands of invertebrates mainly. And among the most important of those invertebrates are many, many different species of Diptera. So it's not a romantic occupation, but our planet would be in a pretty tough way if we didn't have these guys. So next time you see that poop, tip your hat to the fly that's about to eat it. Next slide. Another place where flies have really helped human beings is their contributions to science and technology. And we don't usually think of insects in that way, but some of the insects have really taught us as much about our own biology as our own biology has. And maybe number one on this list is the common fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster. We know more genetically about this organism than just about any animal, including ourselves, in the world. And it's taught us an enormous amount about how virtually every biological process in animals works. So it's really hard to diminish the impact that this little tiny fly has had on human medicine, on all aspects of animal biology. From genomics down to all kinds of different therapies that as individuals we benefit from biomedically. The list is so enormous that we could spend multiple sessions talking about the magic that's been conveyed to humanity by a model like fruit flies. And they, I guess, are also really awesome food for mantises. So next slide. A lot of flies had been just wonderful models in teaching us about the biology, the behavior, and the ecology and evolution of all kinds of animals, including ourselves. This is just one example, but people have spent a lot of energy trying to understand a process of sexual selection, for example. Why is it that males and females frequently have different traits, like a peacock and a male peacock displaying feathers and being selected for in terms of male quality being in the quality of his feathers in effect, and mate choice by females. Antlers on deer. There are just kind of countless examples. But some of the most elegant work is actually been on flies that you probably have never heard of. And so these really crazy looking flies are in the right side, called stalk-eyed flies. They have this super exaggerated, where their eyes quite literally are on the ends of stalks. And this is a sexually selected trait because it's not something that really connects with me, but the more stalky your eyes are, the more attractive you are to female stalk-eyed flies is what it comes down to. And models like this have taught us a great deal about how sexual selection operates in all kinds of different animals. Next slide. Another place where flies have really helped us a lot as biologists is in understanding how it is that organisms speciate. And what is it that enables organisms to become reproductively isolated to the point that they're separate from other organisms? And that's really the kind of the operational definition of a species. And we've known as biologists for a really, really long time that speciation kind of works on two levels. One level is what we call allopatric speciation. And what that comes down to is organisms become geographically separated from one another, and they breed in these different geographic populations, and over time they genetically diverge enough that they're no longer capable of mating with one another, and at that point they've speciated. But another way that organisms speciate is sympatrically, and that is they literally are in the same place, but they become reproductively isolated anyway. And for a very long time, a lot of people didn't really think that this was significant, but a lot of people working on insects had a sense that it very much was. And it's driven, and it's been a kind of a significant contributor to very high levels of speciation in a lot of insect groups. And really the insects that taught us this were flies. And in particular, a genus called Ragalides, which is a type of fruit fly. And it's taught us an enormous amount about how animals and plants and other types of organisms on our planet have ended up achieving the diversity that we see today that we're all kind of completely dumbfounded by. Next slide. Technologically, flies have been the inspiration for a lot of our flying robots, drones, things like that. These are quite literally fly bots that are truly about the size of a penny, and the technology has reached a point that robots at this size are on our doorstep. So drones can get a lot smaller. And so a lot of groups are on this verge. And the reason that flies are so attractive is they're among our most agile flyers of any animal. And so the flight of flies has been the inspiration for making extremely agile mechanicals like this that have applications that are almost infinite. Next slide. Luminescence, beetles are pretty awesome and fireflies are pretty awesome, but luminescence isn't restricted to fireflies. We have all kinds of luminescent organisms, and maybe some of you have seen these. We have certain types of flies in North America and in New Zealand that are luminescent. A lot of these are Ophelia fultoni that I'm showing in this slide is in southern Appalachia. And what's really remarkable about these guys is they make little webs on rocks near streams, and they're luminescent because a little bit like turning a porch light on, and it attracts insects. They use their luminescence to capture prey because they're predators in their immature stages. And so at night on these rocks that look like there's nothing there, it's absolutely fantastic when you see these guys in southern Appalachia, and they're relatively common. You just have to go out after sunset and into areas of waterfalls and streams, and it's pretty magical. They're just little tiny midges, but they're really, really beautiful. And the significance of it is that the biochemistry of luminescence and using that for all kinds of different applications really comes from figuring out how luminescence worked in these insects and how it worked in fireflies. Next slide. We'll end the beneficial side of things on how flies have helped medicine. Something that maybe a few of you have heard of, but is really used fairly commonly, is using certain species of flies to clean wounds that are very, very difficult to heal. And this is because these fly maggots feed on decomposed tissue, but they won't feed on living tissue. And they produce all kinds of molecules that are very antiseptic. So it seems kind of disgusting to put maggots into a wound, but for certain kinds of puncture wounds, the medical community has really bought into using flies to this purpose, and with very high efficacy. And so if it was between maggots in the wound and potentially losing your foot, you'd probably go for maggots in the wound. More seriously, a lot of these maggots have also been the source of identifying a number of compounds now that are used as antibacterials and antibiotics that we use in all kinds of different applications. And it comes from a pretty humble source, something like a green bottlefly that I don't think any of us think very fondly of on the surface. Next slide. So now we're going to kind of switch over to talking about flies as pests. Next slide. The first place that I'd like to start with this, before we start moving to things that most of us are most uncomfortable with, which are the flies that bite us, is to talk about pest flies in association with plants. Because you've seen a lot of these things, but you maybe didn't always know exactly what you were looking at. So the majority of flies are herbivores. That is, they mainly in their immature stages, they feed on plants, just the way herbivores are more common than predators in all animal groups. And in so doing, a great many of them have biologies, for example, of producing abnormal growths on plants or galls. Now, a lot of different insects and a few other organisms can make these kind of cancerous growths on plants occur, but some of the coolest looking galls are made by flies. And these Cystidomyiid gall midge flies are really our most prominent gallers in the fly world, and you see these little bumps on leaves or on the sides of plants all the time. One thing that's kind of fun to do is sometimes is just pop them open, because a lot of times there'll be a little insect in there, and it might be an aphid, it might be a fly, and you eventually start to learn which insects made which galls. Another thing you've seen is where the leaf didn't get literally eaten, but it gets mined. That is, a fly maggot moves between the upper and the lower surface of the leaf and eats all the juicy parts in between. And so these are leaf miners. And leaf miners are incredibly species rich, and they can cause a lot of damage to plants. And we have a little example of this in this upper right panel. And then maybe the most important thing of all is we have a lot of flies that feed on fruit in their larval or maggot stage. So if you go to the next slide after this one, Sean, these kind of general biologies for herbivorous Diptera is most of them are feeding on plants that it's not economically important to humans that kind of damage is caused. But then we have a relatively small but very significant number of flies that feed on things that are really valuable to people. And so they're doing the same things they're doing in all kinds of other plants, but they're damaging something that means something monetarily to us, and so we call it a pest. And flies that are serious pests are mainly pests of fruit crops and grains, and some bulbs like onions and ornamentals like tulips or daffodils or things like that. And so we have certain fruit fly pests that are quite serious. Some are under extreme quarantine where you can't move fruit very easily between countries, or there are very, very strict rules because of risks of importing pest species from another part of the world that could establish themselves, for example, in the United States. We also have a number of fruit pests that already have been established from other parts of the world, and they cause really, really serious damage. A close relative of the common fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, is a species called the spotted wing Drosophila. And this is maybe one of our most serious pests in the United States right now, because it's a very promiscuous feeder on all kinds of different fruit crops that have a huge monetary value, and people are quite spending a lot of money right now trying to control this insect. A lot of our grain crops are attacked by midges of one sort or another. And then there are many other kinds of fruit flies besides spotted wing Drosophila that can be major problems in virtually all of our economically important fruit plants that all over the world. Next slide. So the remaining time that I'm going to spend is talking about flies as pests of humans and other animals, because that's what a lot of us are really familiar with, and one of the main reasons that many of us really hate flies. So I'm going to talk about a handful of groups going from, and I think these are all things that everyone has seen, even if you weren't quite sure what it was you were looking at. Horseflies and deer flies, I think, are something that's familiar to most of us. And these are, they blood feed, like all the insects that we're about to talk about. They blood feed on vertebrates because they need the protein to produce eggs. So they're blood feeding on you for reproduction. And that means that the only individuals that are blood feeding on you are females. Males of these insects are not blood feeders, and they just get a really bad rap from their sisters, who are the blood feeders. So tabanids, horseflies, and deer flies, they're what we call pool feeders. They have mouth parts that are kind of shaped like little knives, and they slice a wound in you, and they create a pool of blood that they'll lap up. And if you're bitten by one of these guys, it can be quite painful. The saving grace is that they're kind of slow, and so you can usually slap them before they get you. Where there are more serious problem is with a lot of livestock, where they can be a pretty serious irritant in certain parts of our country and other parts of the world, feeding on cows and horses. There are a lot of different species, and you really can pick up on them because they have these iridescent compound eyes that you see in the upper right. And they look like they're kind of wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses. And when you see a fly like that, you can just about bet on it being a tabanid, a horsefly, or a deer fly. And the wound that you see on the lower right, it gets pretty inflamed and it's painful. So most people don't care for deer flies and horseflies very much. Next slide. Another one that isn't exactly a family favorite are black flies. And tabanids in the previous slide, that was a brachyceran, and it had that real chunky body that we were talking about earlier. But black flies, they're nematocerans, and in their immature stages, they live primarily in running water. There are lots of different species, and most of them are really host specific, and they feed on particular species of birds or mammals. A few of them, though, feed on humans. And the ones who love humans can really make your life miserable in certain parts of our country and other parts of the world when they're emerging. Most of them only, though, have like one generation a year or a couple. So their seasonal activity is restricted, which is a small saving grace. But when they're out, they can be out in enormous numbers and be pretty terrible. They too are pool feeders, and they have a lot of anesthetics in their spit. So you a lot of times don't feel them biting you, and then later on you have all these bites in some inaccessible area, like this poor lady in the lower right who was bitten on her neck. I think some of you have been in New England or in Minnesota or Canada, and you may be seeing some pretty spectacular numbers of black flies, where it's almost impossible to be outside without some kind of protection. Next slide. Going to transition now to a fly that has a kind of a certain life lesson for us, and that's screwworms. And this was a really serious pest in the United States up until the late 1960s. And it's because it was it's one of the few flies that the larvae feed on living tissue. And so the fly would lay its eggs to a wound site, primarily in livestock, and then the flies would quite literally eat the cow's head and or some other part of its body, and it was causing millions and millions of dollars of damage. After these things feed on their vertebrate host, and it could be a human too, they drop into the soil and they pupate, and they have really short generation time, so they could build up huge populations. And the reason I'm telling you all this is because we don't have screwworms in the United States anymore, because the USDA and other scientists figured out that they could release huge numbers of sterilized males, that males were sterilized using gamma radiation. And they would release these in enormous numbers in Florida and Texas, where these flies tended to overwinter. And by having so many sterile males in the population, females would mate with them, but by mating with a sterile male, they couldn't produce any viable progeny. And in this way, this is how screwworm was controlled in the United States. And then it's relevant to you because what the US has done is it's pushed screwworm populations into extreme southern Mexico and Central America. And we have large facilities that are producing sterile screwworm males to this day, to the tune of millions of dollars, to manage screwworm in the Central American peninsula. And it's all to keep screwworm from re-entering its former range in the central and southwestern United States. So this is a way of of having solved a problem without using insecticides that was incredibly effective for a pretty horrible pest insect. Next slide. Another one that I wanted to show you because it kind of illustrates an important point is a few flies have evolved to not really even look like flies anymore. And that's because they're parasites of mammals or birds. These are hippobosids. Any of you who've worked in agriculture in sheep or in some other livestock have maybe seen these. And in the right side, you can see they almost look like ticks. They have no wings, and their mouth parts and their legs are rather tick-like, and they give live birth in the same way that tsetse flies do. So that funky little thing on the far right over here is really like a baby kid. Some of them, though, have in this family still have wings, and they still find their host, and they feed on them, like the bird that I'm showing on the left. These are really host-specific. A lot of different species, and they're mostly feeding on particular vertebrates of one sort or another. A number of KEDs actually are pretty serious pests in the livestock industry and are a significant problem, both in the United States and some other parts of the world. Next slide. The last one I want to talk about is it's sort of one of our fly parasites that just has such a bizarre biology, you just got to hear it. And so these are human bot flies. And so what we have is it's a kind of a homely looking adult on the upper left side. And what's so cool about these guys in a biological way, but not so cool if you end up being having bot flies, is the female, she actually lays her eggs on mosquitoes. And so she puts the egg on the body of the mosquito pretty close to its head. And when the mosquito finds a host to feed on, it puts its mouth parts in, and it's going to take a blood meal. It makes a little tiny wound. And if it's a mammal host, the body heat of the mammal causes that egg to hatch incredibly fast, because in effect there's a little botfly larva inside of that egg. And so that larva runs down the mouth parts of the mosquito and jumps right into the wound site. And once it gets under the skin, it develops, and you get these kind of pimply looking things on the lower right side, and eventually this is going to emerge from the host, pupate in the soil, and produce a new generation. So these will feed on humans. They're relatively common in parts of South America still, and in Central America. I was at a party once where someone who was doing some field work in Peru, she had a botfly under the scalp of her forehead. And being an entomologist and being a little nerdy, I guess, she was going to let it rear through. And during this party, quite literally, the fellow on the lower left came out of her head, and I was there when it happened. And so that definitely made for some kind of nerdy entomological conversation. Generally, the recommendation in all seriousness is sometimes these could be surgically removed, but if you end up with a botfly, it's usually to let nature run its course rather than trying to remove it. In the United States, we don't naturally have these, but like I said, they're not very far away, and they just have such a surreal biology, I had to share it. Next slide. Yeah, that is definitely a yuck. I want to end with talking about flies. Yeah, entomology parties are they're really pretty hip. Flies as vectors of animals and human diseases. And so there are quite a few that are pretty serious in this way. Mosquitoes, some black flies, a particular species that cause river blindness in Africa, sandflies that are no-see-ums that we have a number of species in Central America and other parts of the world that transmit leishmaniasis. No-see-ums transmit several viruses. And we already talked about tsetse flies that transmit the causative agent of sleeping sickness, mainly in Africa, that was giving birth to those live young. Next slide. So this is a really interesting slide, I think, that I didn't make, but I borrowed, that really illustrates an important point, which is newspapers and television especially have a deathly fear of sharks. and a number of other organisms in terms of potentially killing people. And small numbers of people all over the world are killed by these organisms. But who we should fear the most is obviously ourselves, with an estimated 475,000 people annually being killed by other humans. Snakes are kind of respectable, but given how many billion of us are on the planet, 50,000 is pretty small. But by far and away, the #1 killer, and arguably the most dangerous animal on the planet for humans, are mosquitoes, which are responsible for close to 1 million deaths a year worldwide. Next slide. So mosquitoes are responsible for transmitting a number of different human pathogens. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of them for the sake of time. The first one is malaria, and I think everybody's heard about malaria. And this is a map of just where malaria currently is endemic in the dark red, and where malaria has largely been eliminated but was quite prominent in former times, including substantial parts of the United States. And so this is caused by a type of protozoan in the genus Plasmodium. And you can read this slide, but quite literally billions of people all over the world are at risk from malaria every year to this day. 120 million cases annually, and that's probably conservative at the moment. And then about 700,000 deaths a year currently as well. And that isn't much different from 2015 to 2021. Most of these deaths are in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's some mortality in the Asian subcontinent as well. And so this is pretty serious. It's out of sight for the United States, but it wasn't very long ago your great-grandparents were at risk of malaria, and we grossly underestimated the number of people in the United States who died of malaria up until the late, really into the early 20th century. So malaria is under control for a lot of its range, but it's definitely not under control in other parts of the world at the present time. Next slide. There are quite a few different species of Plasmodium that cause malaria in humans, 11. The most serious one is falciparum, Plasmodium falciparum, which is what causes most malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. What you might not know is there are really hundreds of species of malaria parasites, and many other animals besides people contract malaria. There are malarias that are bird-specific or reptile-specific, or that cause malaria in other mammals. And it's because these parasites are kind of specific, with some being able to develop in us and others being able to develop in other animals. And then importantly, some mosquitoes feed on humans specifically or preferentially, and many, many other mosquitoes don't feed on us at all. There are about 3,000 species of mosquitoes worldwide, and only a tiny number of them really feed on people. The other ones are feeding primarily on other vertebrates. Next slide. So there are all kinds of different species of mosquitoes that can potentially transmit malaria all over the world to human beings, but they all belong to one genus, which is called Anopheles. So anopheline mosquitoes are malaria vectors. And we have the vector for human malaria still in the United States. Quadrimaculatus is our most common one. The thing is that we've managed in other ways to control the population of this mosquito and to control Plasmodium, as has been done in Europe and other parts of the world, but is very much a struggle in a lot of the tropics, which is why we have such big problems. Next slide. The other one that I was going to talk about is dengue fever, because it's a viral disease transmitted by mosquitoes, and it's the most common mosquito-borne viral disease in the world. There are many different other viruses that are transmitted by mosquitoes, but there are about 100 million cases of dengue annually, mainly in South America, but in other parts of the world. It really just gives you a terrible case of the flu in most people, but it can create quite serious disease in a small percentage of individuals who die or suffer pretty severely from hemorrhagic fever. And the life cycle of this is very simple. Mosquitoes pick up the virus in a blood meal when they feed on somebody. It incubates in the mosquito for about 14 days, and that female mosquito, if she feeds again on another person, she can transmit that virus. And then you end up with flu-like symptoms, like I said. This is very, very common in South America, and it's a little bit like influenza in the United States, where it has an effect economically because people lose work time and they feel terrible. But in some parts of the world, it's quite common. It's not common in the United States, although we do get a few cases of dengue in California, Florida, South Texas. And some of it's due to immigration. Some of it's due to us having the vectors that can transmit this pathogen. Next slide. Oh, I forgot about this because I don't have control of the slides. Go ahead and call these up, Sean. The main vectors of these are Aedes aegypti and albopictus. Albopictus is all over West Virginia, and it's all over Georgia too. Aedes aegypti is a little more tropically oriented in the United States. Aedes aegypti is mainly in Florida, South Texas, and Southern California. But we definitely have the vector for dengue, and under the right circumstances, we could end up with a lot more cases of dengue than we have currently. Next slide. This is my final slide, and I wanted to talk just a little teeny bit about why is it that we don't have malaria and how is it that we manage mosquito populations. The truth is that for controlling adults, we're still pretty reliant on insecticides, mainly pyrethroids, which many of you use around your house all the time. In some parts of the world, you might not believe it, but they still use DDT to control mosquitoes because it works very well, even though it has a lot of environmental issues associated with it. Something many of you have done is you can buy materials from hardware stores like mosquito dunks that you can put in breeding sites. These are bacterial products, so these are kind of using toxins that are produced by certain kinds of bacteria that kill mosquitoes but are harmless to fish and amphibians and mammals like ourselves. But the most important thing we've done is it's habitat management in industrialized parts of the world, combined with us having a temperate climate. And these things have enabled us to manage mosquito populations a lot more easily than is the case in a lot of tropical regions. One thing that's pretty cool is I wanted to tell you something about screwworms because sterile male release programs is something that's on the verge of becoming more prevalent for mosquito control in certain parts of the world. In fact, it's ongoing right now. And people are pretty optimistic that this is going to have an impact, especially, for example, in trying to manage dengue in South America and in Asia. The other thing some of you might be interested in are repellents. So things like DEET, when you use off or cutter, the most common repellent is a compound called DEET, and I put the chemical structure to the side. This has been around since the Second World War, and it still remains our most reliable repellent for mosquitoes. There are some other ones that are registered for use, picaridin, eucalyptus oil, and a compound called IR3535 that you might see on a product. All of these work. Picaridin maybe works almost as well as DEET, but the other two don't. So generally, DEET remains the gold standard, even though it's the oldest of the materials that are available to us. There's also a lot of really interesting sidebars about how these compounds work. It's been a mystery for a very long time, and it's still a little bit controversial, but some kind of interesting things. But for the sake of time, because we lost a lot of minutes with our technical snafus, I wanted to try to stay pretty close to being on time. And so I'm stopping here, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. But hopefully I've given you some sense that there are a lot of flies that are really, really serious problems for human beings, but out of that 125,000 species worldwide, 95% of them or more cause no problem to humans at all, and have really important roles in other aspects of our planet.
Thank you, Dr. Strand. We do have some questions that have come in from the internet here that we can throw up for you.
So give some examples of habitat management efforts to mitigate mosquito populations. On the most local scale, you're your own best friend. Most of our mosquito problems in urban areas and towns is that these are species of mosquitoes that we call container breeders, and so they breed in a bucket, they breed in any puddle, they breed in mostly containers that humans have created, beer cans thrown on the side of the road. So emptying those containers at your own home is one of the very best things that you can do. People are sometimes a little bit oblivious to these small containers containing a lot of times large numbers of mosquito larvae. So local care in this way by you and your neighbors can make an enormous difference, because some of these mosquitoes, as adults, they don't even travel very far, just a couple hundred meters in their whole life. So if you're being bitten like crazy, odds are you or your neighbors are responsible for this. So this is something that all of us could kind of take a social responsibility for if we were aware of it. But getting the word out to people and just being a little self-aware about your own local environment can make an enormous difference. Nations and groups like USDA in the United States and EPA and state agencies, they manage habitat on a greater scale. Some of it has been the pluses and minuses of marshland destruction. So on the one hand, it's been really terrible for a lot of environmental reasons. Some of it was also done for mosquito control, and it made a big difference in a positive way. So weighing the costs and the benefits of habitat management in that way is very, very complicated. We have mosquito control districts in a lot of the southern states and in California, where counties or local units treat water mainly using Bacillus BT products like I was talking about. That's another form of habitat management. So in certain areas where you can have very high mosquito populations, government takes responsibility. But in many other situations, local citizenry could do an enormous amount of good by being self-aware.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to encourage people to go ahead and ask your question now, because you could win a prize. We have Blanco glass. Actually, we have a cicada and a dragonfly, which you could win in our drawing at the end if you ask a question for the professor. So let's have our next question.
So are fleas flies that have evolved and lost their wings? Fleas are not flies, but those keds, in a sense, you know, some of the other people who've talked in this in other sessions have talked about convergence. So a lot of parasitic insects have lost their wings as a consequence of their parasitic biology, especially if they're parasites of birds or mammals, because you can kind of imagine that wings get in the way, so to speak, of moving between hair or feathers. And so there's been selection over time for wing loss because of the environment those organisms live in. But fleas belong to their own order. They're an order called Hymenoptera, and it's about 2,000 species. And every flea in the order Hymenoptera is a parasite of vertebrates. So they're not flies, but they are holometabolous insects, and they're kind of in the neighborhood. They go through a complete metamorphosis. They have biologies that are kind of like some flies, like the Keds I talked about, but evolutionarily, they're not in the Diptera. Do all mosquitoes spread the same diseases? That's a really good question, and the answer is no. Most mosquitoes species have a kind of they tend to spread certain kinds of pathogens. So, but there are a few situations where a particular mosquito species can be the vector of more than one thing. So, for example, a minute ago I was talking about malaria, and malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes in the genus Anopheles. And we have Anopheline mosquitoes all over the world, and many of them are competent vectors to transmit malaria, but they can't transmit a pathogen like dengue virus. Anopheline mosquitoes don't provide the right environment for dengue virus to be able to propagate itself. And so a different group of mosquitoes are what we call competent vectors for dengue virus. West Nile virus, certain kinds of encephalitis viruses that cause encephalitis. Again, they're preferentially being transmitted by certain kinds of mosquitoes. Some of this has to do with the range of the mosquito. Some of it has to do with biological interactions that make it compatible for a given pathogen to be able to persist in it, and other ones they can't. In the same way that not all influenza viruses infect us. They can infect other kinds of organisms. So pathogens themselves have specificity properties where COVID, big mystery of where it came from, but there are all kinds of mammals and birds that would not be very good hosts for COVID virus, even though we now are quite a good host for it.
So the next one from Susan.
This is so maybe I missed this, but are some people more prone to bites than others? Yes. And I was remiss in not saying that. You didn't miss it, but your question is true, and yes, people do vary. This has been a really active area of study because people have for a very long time known that some people seem to be mosquito magnets, or sometimes you have certain kinds of flies that are just flat obnoxious. They just fly around your head when you're in the woods or something. And they don't bite you, but they're really irritating. And it seems like that, the guy next to you doesn't have any, and they're just making you miserable. And the reasons for this is because the main thing that attracts these insects to you is CO2. So you inhale oxygen, but you expire carbon dioxide. And so mosquitoes and many other blood-feeding flies are attracted to carbon dioxide. A lot of traps that honestly aren't very effective, what they're doing is they're putting out a little stream of carbon dioxide, and that's the bait to try to get mosquitoes to fly to it instead of to fly to you. But everybody's is expelling CO2. One school of thought is that some people are respiring at a higher rate than others, or you're more attractive when you're running or perspiring because you're consuming more oxygen and you're expelling more CO2. But the main thing is that people have learned by all kinds of different studies is that we don't all expel the same profile of odors in perspiration, and that's coming off of our skin. And some people produce compounds that are more attracted to mosquitoes than others, or they produce blends of sweat that are more attractive to biting flies, for example, than other individuals. So there really is variation among people, and you're not wrong in thinking that.
I'm unfortunately one of those that attracts mosquitoes more than
Yeah, we all have a story to tell in that way. So why do flies, when trapped in your house, fly toward the light? The truth is a great many insects are attracted to light. We refer to this as being positively phototactic. A lot of insects are attracted to lights, and the way that entomologists, for example, the way that a lot of times you collect insects, especially nocturnal ones, is put up a light, especially one that's a little more in the UV side of the spectrum, short wavelength. You put up a UV light and you'll catch some of the most fantastic, beautiful moths. Just put up a sheet, put up a UV light, grab the kind of libation you most enjoy in the evening, sit back, and it's magical. So those flies really aren't doing anything differently than a lot of other insects. But I think one of the really interesting things is we don't really fully understand why insects are so positively phototactic. It has to do with flying in part. Some insects orient by the sun. And the way they kind of know up from down is by orientation of light. So that's part of the story. But flies flying to the window is, if you had a great many other insects that were in the house at the same time, they do the same thing.
So if you had a light on the floor, if they tell up and down from light, they would get mixed up and think.
Yeah, I mean, but you'd have to paper over your windows because your windows would be really attractive still. But if it was nighttime and you put a little light in the room and there were insects in the house, they would go to the light because there wouldn't be any light coming out of the windows.
Before we go on, I have a question.
Sure.
First of all, thank you for handling a very difficult subject, because what we've heard tonight, flies are kind of horrifying, bot flies and some of the others you talked about. Is it the most dangerous order in terms of interactions with humans?
Well, with that slide, the kind of bubble graph that I borrowed, emphatically yes, because if you'd looked, mosquitoes pretty much overwhelmed everything else except us.
Right.
But there were quite a few other Diptera that were on there because those flies are the major disease vectors. For those pathogens that are transmitted by arthropods, by another organism, ticks, or insects, the vast majority of them are transmitted by Diptera. And mosquitoes are number one, bar none. But some of those other groups have species in them that are disease vectors too. Now, the thing is that, keep in mind, 3,000 species of mosquito sounds pretty terrible, but 125,000 species of Diptera, it's quite literally a little blip on the screen. And there are all these other flies that are doing all these wonderful things of pollinating your plants and eating your poop and all these other great things that you benefit from enormously. They're just out of sight. Yeah. A lot of them are teeny tiny. You just barely notice them. If you scrape your car grill and you look for who had two wings, there'd be a lot of them there, but you just don't notice them yet. They're everywhere. And they're doing all kinds of cool things for you.
That's a great point, and thank you for bringing up the benefits. Just a follow-up question before we move on. Your graphic, I use the shark mosquito thing to kind of promote because I that's what I do.
But, he's known as a shark guy.
There was a snail on there. 10,000. What's that about?
So snails. Snails are an intermediate host for schistosomes, a type of parasite so they, in certain parts of the tropics, again in Africa, but also in South America, schistosomiasis is a fairly serious disease. So those 10,000 deaths are attributable to schistosomiasis. And so the vector for schistosomiasis, in effect, are snails. But snails don't bite you. What they do is they shed a particular stage of the schistosome parasite into bodies of water, and these are the stages that can infect humans. And so if it wasn't for snails being in the water, that parasite wouldn't be able to infect people. Okay. So the cycle of it is that people shed schistosomes into the water primarily from poor hygiene. So runoff from sewage or from pooping directly in the water is what introduces the parasite into bodies of water. The snail is the intermediate host for the parasite. And then the stage of the parasite that can reinfect a human is shed from the snail. So that was why it was on the slide.
I see.
Now, speaking of parasites, I remember when I took your class, you had us bring home these little cups with some sort of insect in it, and we were supposed to take care of them and keep a log of it. And then one day I woke up and my insect had been eaten from the inside out, and I was kind of horrified. Are all of these parasites, are they in the fly order?
No. Yeah, they're not. So if you remember from that class and you were horrified by those insects, which were really pretty awesome because they were teeny tiny and they turned that little caterpillar into a Cheeto. But your subject last week was on Hymenoptera. So Hymenoptera, membrane wing, but bees, wasps, and ants. And the speaker focused primarily on talking about bees as pollinators. Spent a little bit of time talking about ants, but talked a lot about honeybees and talked a lot about other species of bees and bee biology. There are about 250,000 described species of Hymenoptera, and about 85% of them are parasites. And he didn't talk about those guys hardly at all. And so tachinids that I talked about a second ago of having the alien biology, the vast majority of alien biology is really in the order Hymenoptera. And the creepy guys that came out of your, that you were horrified by was a little wasp that was about 1 millimeter long. And I don't know if you remember the story, Aaron, but the wasp I gave you guys has the most bizarre biology because the little parasite puts an egg into the egg of a moth, and the egg hatches and the caterpillar grows, and that's what you watched in the cup. But inside the body of that caterpillar the whole time was the egg of the wasp that put it in there. But the really surreal part is that egg, it clones itself. And so the egg is like identical twinning in humans. So every once in a while, someone gives birth to identical twins or rarely quadruplets. But this one produces about 3,000 identical twins inside the body of the caterpillar. And then all of the twins hatch as larvae all at the same time, and they eat the caterpillar in one fell swoop. And so you ended up with this giant flush of little tiny insects coming out of that caterpillar, but they were all genetically identical. They were little clones of the egg that the mom put in at the very beginning. It's called polyembryony, and it's just one of the weirdest things. Armadillo, for those of you who are kind of think these kind of things are cool, armadillos are obligately polyembryonic. In North America, they all produce quadruplets, and they're genetically identical. It's our only mammal that produces quadruplets every generation. It's people every once in a while, but armadillos all the time, and a few parasitic Hymenoptera super all the time in a super crazy way. But the other ones, most Hymenoptera that are parasites are not polyembryonic, but they have biologies like those tachinids.
Yep. Let's have one more question from the audience before we do our drawing.
All right.
Yes. So the question of could mosquitoes be causing bird sickness? So one of the things that I debated doing was talking about West Nile virus because it was something that every one of us had heard about, and it's still with us. So West Nile virus is transmitted by a mosquito, but the the big scare with West Nile virus, if you remember this, is that we had a small epidemic in New York. And then later we learned that West Nile virus was spreading all over the country. And so this virus, though, is transmitted by mosquitoes that are in a group of mosquitoes called, the genus is Culex. And these mosquitoes are mainly bird feeders. And this is a virus that actually can infect humans and cause sickness, but we're not the best hosts for it. The best hosts are birds. And so West Nile virus, what it really did to the United States was a lot of significant bird mortality for a while. Certain bird populations suffered quite badly. Most of them, though, have recovered. And most of them, there's a lot of resistance to West Nile virus in certain bird species. So it swept through populations and caused a lot of mortality, but the level of mortality it causes now is not as high because it's all over the country. And we still get a tiny number of cases of West Nile virus in humans, but in birds is the real reservoir for it. And there are other mosquito-borne diseases that cause disease in birds as well, but that's the one that's that we've heard the most about from the news.
Thank you, Dr. Strand. Excellent presentation. Difficult circumstances and subject. We appreciate it.
Yeah, well, you're welcome, and I'm so sorry to the audience that we had the little glitch that we had, but I guess we kind of worked our way through it.
We did. We made it, and you did a great job. In the end, it was a very fine program, and we have to do a drawing. We have 2 sun catchers to give away, as I mentioned. But before we do that, I wanted to encourage people, because you only have 2 weeks left to do this, to come to the library and find this guy. This is a mug, by the way, that we're giving away next week. Take a picture with him, and you could win the cicada art that Bob Villamagna made. You could also win another prize that I'm not going to tell you about. This Tuesday, we have our library staff member, Nate, and you talked about the fruit flies being good food for mantises. And you will learn all about the Chinese praying mantis.
We have one of them here.
And there's one of them there. Which one is it?
This is Sassy Sally.
Sassy Sally, yeah. She's
very cool.
Look at that. Yeah, she's sassy because she's the very active mantis. Nate, who has bred them for 6 years, said he's never seen one quite so active. So you can meet her on Tuesday, and we'll talk with Nate all about them. And if you're with us in person, you can actually probably hold one because we're socializing them. And so that's Tuesday. And next Thursday, we will talk about butterflies and moths with Catherine Holcomb, Lepidoptera, which is a much different order than. I
mean, how many people hate butterflies?
It's kind of unfair, right?
It is a little unfair.
I'm sorry. So let's do our drawing let's start with the
before we
dragonfly.
Do that, just remind people that they can enter to name these. We've named them Sassy Sally and Chill Jill, but those are temporary names. And if you go to our website, you can enter your own names for our green one and our brown one.
There you go.
Also you can enter into a prize for that. Okay. So raffle number 1 is for what?
The dragonfly sun catcher from Blanco Glass, a West Virginia stalwart.
And that goes to Andrea Allen.
Andrea, yay. And the second one is a very cool, this is their new sun catcher. It's 2 cicadas on one sun catcher. So that'll be the name number.
Goes to Carolyn Ziegler.
Yay, Carolyn.
Okay. All right.
Who's been with us from the beginning and has finally won. And she won pretty much one of the coolest things we've given away. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Strand.
You're welcome.
Aaron, and everyone who participated tonight. We'll see you Tuesday, and we'll see you next week for butterflies. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.